A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 prolific team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos, es ist getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode has been generously sponsored anonymously in honor of the listeners of Jewish History Soundbites. You heard that, listeners? This one is for you. And it's very apropos to this great community of Jewish History Soundbites listeners to have this episode dedicated in your honor. I want to first start off with an apology for not having put out an episode for a while. I was out on some trips to Europe, and actually it was a great trip. It was one of them just now, came back last week from the Chestnut Shul in Lakewood. Great trip. So been recovering from that. To Poland, we went all over, from Rimanov, right after Mendel of Rimanov's yahrzeit, to Lezhensk and everything in between. We even had a powerful moment at the crematorium of Auschwitz when a participant of the trip made a siyum in memory of the 6 million while he was wearing his grandfather's inmate cap from the camp, an original inmate cap, and it was in the pouring rain. It was a very great moment. I never had that on a group before, that someone wore his survivor grandparents' article of their clothing. And then we had a kelmale from another participant that tore through the skies. It was a very, very powerful trip. And then, of course, everyone is here for Shavuos in Israel. And so I've been taking around people on walking tours of the old neighborhoods of Yerushalayim and some Kivrei Tzadikim all over. And it's been a lot of fun. So, unfortunately, I neglected the podcast a little bit. But we're back, and we're going to have, it's been hectic, but did not have a standard episode prepared. So we're going to do something a little bit different this time. Some musings about Shavuos and Jewish history, and some little short tributes of some recent historic passings in the Jewish world. And I hope to get back on track with normal and consistent episodes for the great summer season. We'll have weekly episodes, very interesting topics. There's a lot of stuff already in line. So stay tuned in Jewish History Soundbites. There will be a lot of great content coming on a weekly basis right after Shavuos. Also, once we're talking about Shavuos and the busy season and the hectic times, so in the Mishpacha magazine for Shavuos, if you haven't gotten it already, then run out today and get it before Shavuos. First of all, there is an excellent article by my colleague, Davi Safir, which I helped out with a little bit, but it was actually researched and written almost entirely by him, and a very modest contribution myself, and about Rabbi Dr. Leo Jung. A fascinating article, and he did some very, very original and creative research, Davi, so I recommend you read that as well. And he and I, of course, have our extended For the Record feature in Mishpacha Magazine's Shavuos edition, and it's about the 100-year, the centennial of the dedication of the building of the MTJ Yeshiva on the Lower East Side. And if I might say so myself, I think it's an interesting column as well. So there's lots of great stuff out there in Jewish history. And before we get to some musings that I had about the holiday of Shavuos in Jewish history, I'd first like to make several tributes to some recent passings in the Jewish world. First of all, Rav Simcha Kook, an incredible personality, the Rav of Rehovot, very endearing personality, the very interesting life. He, of course, is from the family of Rav Kook. He was a great nephew, a rabbinic family, and he was, for decades, the rabbi of Rehovot. He oversaw the yeshiva there, which his younger brother is the Rosh Yeshiva of, and a very creative personality who crossed many boundaries in how he related to the different segments of Israeli society within the religious world, in the general society. A very interesting person. We also had the recent passing also of Rav Pinchas Stolper of the NCSY and the OU, where he served in leadership positions of both for decades and decades. A very important leader in the renaissance of orthodoxy and traditional Jewish life across the United States, with his activities in pioneering the work of NCSY in the 50s and 60s, and then later on also in the OU throughout the 20th and early 21st century. Most of all, just yesterday, the passing of Uri Zohar, a fascinating personality. He really deserves a full-length tribute episode, because he was a fascinating person and a special person, a bit of a microcosm, especially his earlier life, of the story of Israeli society in the 60s and 70s, and then his own personal journey of this amazing journey that he transformed his lifestyle and embraced religious observance, and in general that might be a reflection of how he kind of foreshadowed the Teshuvah movement in the state of Israel as a whole, which took place in the primarily 70s and 80s. He embraces religious observance publicly in 1977. He's in the early stages of that movement. The Israeli culture scene in the 1960s and 70s is quite an interesting story in itself. It's this emerging Tel Aviv scene of the culture, of the first radio, then TV, the Israeli film industry, music. Israeli rock is just starting off then, in the whole entertainment world. And what was interesting, what was happening during that time, was that these were Tel Aviv-born individuals who were creating it, which is different than the generation prior. The original culture of Jews in the land of Israel, first Palestine and then the state of Israel, was primarily created by Russian and Polish immigrants to the country. And here it's different. Here it's native born. It's also different than the post-war immigrants, such as Ephraim Kishon, who came from Hungary, and of course is one of the greatest comics and comedians, directors in Israeli history. But still, he's European, and it's a different, somewhat of a different style, even though his reflections on Israeli life during that time were fascinating, very insightful and hilarious. But this group of Tel Aviv-born individuals of the 1930s who emerged in the 1950s and 60s were uniquely Israeli, and even more so Tel Avivian, a very male, Ashkenazi, and secular Israeli culture that comes about. And to an extent, they're the creators of the modern Israeli entertainment scene. So Uri Zohar is right in the center of that. Born in Tel Aviv to Polish Jewish immigrants, of course. He and his friends are, Chaim Topol and Shaika Ophir, Eric Einstein. Like, these are the legendary names of Israeli music and film and theater and all that. They are somewhat of a bohemian bunch also, and Uri Zohar is one of the leaders of this bunch. And then the shock of someone from that society, a leader in that society, an initiator, a creator, embracing religious observance and transforming their lifestyle, was created big waves in Israeli society in the 1970s. At the time that he did it, he later would write a book in Hebrew, it was translated into English and enjoyed immense popularity. In English, it's called "My Friends, We Were Robbed," where he writes a very strong indictment of the secularist society of his youth, and the pleasure-seeking and shallowness, bohemian lifestyle, and he very strong, very sharply worded, and a very influential book. Also, "My Friends, We Were Robbed." He maintains a relationship with his friends from that world, especially Eric Einstein, who becomes his mechutin. Eric Einstein is one of the greatest artists in Israeli history, in music, and in comedy, and everything. Zohar himself traversed different areas of the entertainment industry. He was one of Israel's first, maybe the first stand-up comedian. He was in radio. When Israeli TV emerged, he moved to TV. He was a filmmaker and actor, so he did directing and acting. He won many awards. He started a group called Chavurat Lul, which was, like I said, this group of friends who were this, the creators of that clique in Tel Aviv at the time, and after his becoming religious, he still kind of looked after those friends. Some of his friends did not have children who would say Kaddish for them, so he took it upon himself on their yahrzeits, sometimes even through the year, to say Kaddish for them when they passed away. He outlived most of them, so he had this feeling for the people who he was close with. Even his ex-wife Ilana Ravina, who was a famous actress and singer in Israeli society in the 60s and 70s, and they were married for a couple of years. They got divorced. She moved to England, had a rough life after that, but when she passed away a couple of years ago, so Uri Zohar went to her levaya and said Kaddish. It was interesting, his care, his understanding and his role. In 1977, he's already 42 years old. He's not a young college student. He officially became religious publicly. In fact, he was influenced by a great Torah scholar and creative individual, Rebbe Shlomo Zilberman. Today there's a Zilberman group, community even, in the Old City and other parts of Yerushalayim, where they follow his children, continue his legacy. There's a whole community. They are part of the Churva Shul, which is, it's funny, it's related to Reb Simcha Cook. Reb Simcha Cook was affiliated with the Churva Shul as well. So Rebbe Shlomo Zilberman, who was originally a cipher of living in Shari Chesed, he influenced Uri Zohar. Later on, Uri Zohar plays a large, outsized role in the Kiruv movement itself. He had a very strong association with Lev La'acham. He essentially was one of the heads of the organization. He was involved in other Kiruv organizations, and Hidabrut and others, and did a lot of work with struggling youth, and with even struggling religious youth, and Kiruv and outreach and all kinds of things like that. Amazing career, and a special person, a real tzaddik also, and a lot to say about him and his role in modern Jewish, especially Israeli history. So moving along to some Shavuos musings, some associations that I thought of over the last couple of days of the holiday of Shavuos and Jewish history. First of all, what struck me, especially since last week we were in Poland and I was discussing it with the group, was that the deportations of Hungarian Jewry during the Holocaust took place around Shavuos time. It took place in less than 2 months. 434,000 Hungarian Jews are deported to Auschwitz, the overwhelming majority of whom are gassed upon arrival, and it takes place between May 15th and July 9th. Many of the transports are arriving either on or right around Shavuos. And you'll hear that from many, many survivors and their families, and the yahrzeits that they observe. Hungarian Jewry is exterminated right around Shavuos time. And in fact, in survivor neighborhoods after the war in Israel or in the United States, like Williamsburg and Borough Park, and places in the Merkaz in Israel, and like Bnei Brak, Tel Aviv, Petach Tikva, those areas, it was almost like Shavuos was worse than Tisha B'Av. Shavuos was like this holiday of like a Yom HaShoah. It was like a Holocaust Memorial Day for Hungarian survivors, because that's when all their friends, their families, their parents, their siblings, their spouses, children, yahrzeits were. And that's where they observed it and said Yizkar and Khmelnytsky and everything. Shavuos became this like a memorial holiday for Hungarian Jewry, and in many ways was a tragic holiday. So that's an interesting to note. And what's another even also very interesting is that pretty much exactly a year later, almost exactly a year later, in 1945, was liberation. And it was also right around Shavuos time. I don't know the mystical connection, I'm just pointing out the historical connection. But the liberation, the war ends at the end of April, the beginning of May. That's right before Shavuos, rather. And, a couple of weeks of just physical rehabilitation of these starving, diseased survivors are able to finally recuperate. So it was really Shavuos that was a new beginning. Shavuos was the first time many of them made a conscious decision to attend the services, to attend davening, to either decide for or against participating in religious activity. So many of them did not, right? So that's also an important piece of history. But many of them did. In fact, my dear friend and colleague David Safir just shared with me a video of Rabbi Dr. J.J. Schachter, the son of the famous chaplain, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, of him telling a story about his father, that he was the U.S. Army chaplain, and he was there pretty much right after the liberation of Buchenwald, and he stayed there for quite a bit of time, assisting the survivors. Here is this Orthodox rabbi who's Yiddish speaking. He was able to help the survivors in a way that almost no one else was capable of doing so. And in Shavuos, he arranged with the U.S. Army that they should allocate him a space to have a davening, a Shavuos Yom Tov davening. This is the first public davening, and he publicized it. There's going to be a davening on Shavuos, and everyone's welcome to join. Of course, anyone who is a U.S. Army soldier who is nominally traditional Orthodox attended, but many survivors did as well. There's even pictures of it, by the way. You can actually see pictures of the service taken by a U.S. Army photographer. And J.J. Schachter repeats the story that his father told him that in the middle of this davening, there was a survivor in the back who's yelling, to whom are you praying? To the God who killed your families, your parents, your siblings, your spouses, your children. That's who you're praying to. And it was this very, very disturbing to both to hear this shouting and this obviously troubled individual. And Rabbi Schachter didn't know what to say to him, obviously. So he goes to the back and he puts his arm around his shoulder and he holds his hand and doesn't say anything. What could you say? And he holds it there until the person calms down. But afterwards, Rabbi Schachter pointed out that this person came to shul to say that. He came to the shul to yell that. He didn't yell it from his barracks. He didn't yell it anywhere else. He came to shul. And that's the idea, is that he lived with this emunah, this survivor, this belief, that it wasn't the Nazis who killed his family, it was God who killed his family. So it assumes a deep belief in God's running the world, and at the same time a lack of understanding, a limited capability of human understanding the why of it, and expressing anger about it. But at the same time, he's coming to shul and expressing that belief that in God, and that he had done this act that he was upset about and couldn't understand. More recently, in Jewish history, you have was the 6-Day War ends. We just had this week in Chaf Ches Iyar, the Yom Yerushalayim. So there's the time where the East Jerusalem and the West Bank is occupied by the Israeli army during the 6-Day War, and they get the kaisel back, and everyone's able to go to daven by the kaisel. So it took a few days to clear the area around the kaisel. There was the Mugrabi neighborhood that was there, the homes that were there, they were cleared away. And the first time the Israeli military allowed civilians to go to daven at the kaisel for the first time in 19 years was Shavuos. So Shavuos night becomes this event where everyone goes to the kaisel. Till today, half of Yerushalayim goes to the kaisel on Shavuos night, and I'm sure most of them believe that they're doing it genuinely out of Aliyah L'Regel. Of course, none of them go like that on Shavuos or Sukkot. And what they're really celebrating is a Haredi version of Yom Yerushalayim. But don't tell any of them that, because then they'll stop going. And it's nice that they're going and davening by the kaisel and dancing there. It's very sweet. So if we go further back in Jewish history, we find other tragedies. Of course, Jewish history, we love focusing on tragedies. So we go further back. So the Khmelnytsky massacres of 1648 and 1649, Tach V'Tat, the Gzeiros Tach V'Tat, what's referred to in Jewish history. So it was right around Shavuos. It's fascinating that it takes place then also. In fact, the massacre of the Jewish community in Emes was so terrible, was so tragic, was so vast, that it became the symbol of the whole time of this these murders of Ukrainian Cossacks, of the whole revolt that they're doing against the Polish nobility and aristocracy, and the Jews are caught in the crossfire, and many of them are killed. Many communities are wiped out. So the massacre of the Jewish community in Emes is seen as a symbol of all of this, and many rabbis of the time commemorate that day, Chaf Sivan, the 20th day of Sivan, as the day of mourning, as the day of commemoration. Of course, when a tragedy happens in the Jewish people, so it's customary to set aside that day. It's not just Tisha B'Av, it's a day of tragedy. So the Chaf Sivan, the 20th of Sivan, is the day that it happens. So, that's a day that can be commemorated. And, of course, that can happen at other tragedies throughout Jewish history as well. A special day can be commemorated, just like Chaf Sivan. So that was right around Shavuos, of course. Chaf Sivan is a few days after Shavuos. So the whole time, during that time, was the main primary massacres of Tach V'Tat. If we go even further back, then we go to the First Crusade, into the year 1096, in the Rhine River Valley, in the great ancient communities of Ashkenaz, Mainz and Vermeise, Worms and Speyer and Frankfurt, all those communities of southern Germany today, and the Rhine River Valley, where the early settlement of Ashkenaz was. The First Crusade pretty much wiped it out. That's why Ashkenaz Jews have such a small gene pool. That's why we all need glasses and have to take tests before we get married, so we don't have genetic diseases, and we all have high cholesterol, as we all come from this tiny gene pool, because there were almost no survivors of the First Crusade. That is the main event that happens in the Ashkenaz Jewish history, is this First Crusade, because it almost entirely wipes out the Ashkenaz Jewish world. So, in fact, when we recite, many communities, I think most communities recite Kinnis on Tisha B'Av, which discusses the First Crusade, and one of them dates them. One of them, these ancient, they're written at the time. Then one of them dates them. It says this happened on the week of Shavuos. It happens on Rish Chodesh Sivan. This happened on Gimel Sivan, the third day of Sivan, literally 2 days before Shavuos. And one of them even states that these great Talmudic scholars and the great tzaddikim were killed. So it must be that the week of Shavuos, the week that we receive the Torah is returned to heaven, because these communities represented the people who observed the Torah, and now that they're all being killed, so it must be that the Torah is being returned to heaven at the same week that it was given. So it's an explicit reference to the relationship between the holiday of Shavuos and the tragedy of the First Crusade. So I find it fascinating that all of these things happen all right around the same time. separated by centuries and countries and times and all around Shavuos time. In moving along to other areas of Jewish history and its relationship to Shavuos, not related necessarily to tragedy, it's interesting that on different holidays throughout the Jewish season, it was customary in the Hasidic movement for the followers to Aliyah L'Regel, to go visit the Rebbe, to go spend the Yontif with the Rebbe. So I saw recently that in Lubavitch, in the town, the literal town of Lubavitch, back when the Lubavitcher Rebbes lived there in Russia, so Shavuos was sometimes referred to as the Chag HaMotzim. Motz meaning Moireh Tzedek, of the rabbis. Why? Because the Chabad Hasidic community had hundreds of rabbis who were communal rabbis across the Russian Empire, across the Pale of Settlement and beyond. Hundreds of rabbis who were members of Chabad, who were followers of the Lubavitcher Rebbes, and who were rabbis to communities, diverse communities all over, and great leaders, great Talmidei Chacham, great scholars. And when did they have a chance to go to the Rebbe? They couldn't go Sukkot or Pesach because they belong in their communities. There are so many halachic questions around Sukkot and Pesach, and Sukkot is Rosh Hashanah and Kippur. Sukkot, they can't leave. Pesach is loaded with all kinds of questions and chametz and selling the chametz and kashering the kalim and everything. They can't leave. So these dedicated and loyal rabbis would not go to their own Rebbe for Sukkot and Pesach. Shavuos, there's not really many halachic questions, so this would be the opportunity for the rabbis to go to Lubavitch. So it became to be known as Chag HaMotzim. This is the holiday of the rabbis, because the rabbis got to go to the Rebbe on Shavuos. So it was a very special time. And speaking of the Hasidic movement, so the Baal Shem Tov himself passed away on Shavuos, and that became the yahrzeits of the Baal Shem Tov. In fact, until recently, there was a big gathering in Mezhebish every Shavuos. Now, of course, with the war in Ukraine, it's a bit more challenging. Hopefully, peace will return to the region, and we'll be able to get back to those tours as well. So the Baal Shem Tov himself passes away in Shavuos. Someone pointed out once to me the irony that the Baal Shem Tov, who's the Hasidic movement and everything that symbolizes, and he passes away on the holiday of the receiving of the Torah. Whereas the Vilna Gaon, who's everything that he symbolizes, passes away in Sukkot, which is the Yom Tif of dancing and singing and happiness. And it's maybe it's perhaps to symbolize that the differences that we always emphasize are not as different as we imagine them to be. And every great Jewish leader contained elements of all aspects of the service of God, and just emphasized certain ones which he felt needed emphasis for his followers at his specific time period in history. And there's definitely what to learn from all of them. But the Baal Shem Tov's passing in Shavuos, many attach all kinds of mystical significance to it, and that definitely has a place in history as well. More recently in the Hasidic movement, the Ger Rebbe, the great leader of Polish Jewry, the Imrei Emes, Rebbe Avram Mordechai Alter, who is the successor of his father, the Sfas Emes. From 1905, he led the Ger community and Polish Jewry until 1948, his passing for 43 years during one of the most tumultuous times in Jewish history, and a very dynamic leader, very strong leader in the Polish press. He was known as the King of the Jews, and when he was sought out by the Nazis when they occupied Poland in 1939, they looked for the Wunder Rabbiner, and he was in danger. He personally was in danger, and he was able to escape at the beginning of the war. He arrives in the Holy Land in early 1940, and he's broken with very few family members. Most remained behind. He lost most of his family in the gas chambers in Treblinka, as he did of all of his followers. He did encourage some of his followers to immigrate to Palestine before the war. He himself made 5 visits to Eretz Yisrael before the war. which is rare. And I don't think any other Rebbe did 5 visits in a 20-year period. He established a yeshiva in Yerushalayim, the first Gary yeshiva in Yerushalayim. In 1924, he established a second one in Tel Aviv, Yeshivas Chidushi Harim, which still exists in northern Tel Aviv till today. And he moves into the one in Yerushalayim, into Yeshivas Sfas Emes, where they prepare an apartment for him. And it was kind of a sad state of affairs. This person who had overseen an empire, who had been at the head of every initiative in Poland in the before war, Agudas Yisrael, and the newspaper, the Yiddish Tagblatt, and Daf Yomi, he was involved with the Rameir Shapiro, and he supported Sarah Shanir with the Beis Yaakov, and he was everywhere and everything. He was the leader. And here at the end of his life, broken, having lost everything from the world that had been left behind, with barely anything left, and that's how he lived out his last years. And he passed away on Shavuos of 1948, and it was during the 1948 War of Independence, and there was a Jordanian shelling of Yerushalayim at the time, and of course also yahrzeits was cut off. They were unable to bury him there. They ended up burying him in his courtyard of the yeshiva, which is right opposite the Machane Yehuda Shuk, and I bring all the groups there when we do tours of that area. And it's just like in the middle of, right across from the Shuk, down this little alleyway, you have this, in the middle of this urban environment, you have this gravesite of the Ger Rebbe, the great Ger Rebbe, and to make it even more symbolic, they made a replica of his father's Oihel on his kever in Ger in Poland. So it's this red brick which sticks out like a sore thumb against the Yerushalayim white stone backdrop, and the whole facade there, sticks out, and it's coming to really, convey a strong message about his leadership of Polish Jewry and his unfortunate passing here. So on Shavuos morning, you see thousands of Ger Hasidim heading over to the Shuk area to pay their respects at the Ger Rebbe's kever. So you have also another interesting another interesting aspect was that the story of the famous Ger Tzedek, Graf Potocki, Vilna, the Ger Tzedek Avraham ben Avraham. So allegedly, when he became martyred, he was killed by the church. It was on the second day of Shavuos. And in the sources at the time, Jewish sources at the time, Rabbi Yaakov Emden and other writers, they write about it. So it seems to have been well known at the time. It's not that it was only discovered later. And in the yeshivas of Lithuanian yeshivas of Eastern Europe, in Volozhin, in Radin, and in other places, they would talk about it. The second day Shavuos, there was like this ceremony to relate the story publicly. Hersh Levinson, who was a student of Volozhin, the Chavetz Chaim son-in-law, would do it every year on the second day Shavuos, would tell the whole yeshiva in Radin the story of Graf Potocki and the Ger Tzedek Avram and Avram. There are good sources for it, and yet there's so many details that are still shrouded in legend. It's very unclear. Some doubt that it happened altogether. Others say it was confused with another story that happened at a similar time period, but not really with that family or that place. Or it might have been a different story. It might be that story. It's very confusing, but it's definitely part of yeshiva folklore, and a very important part of yeshiva folklore. So the basis of the story is definitely true, and we need to still work out the details. There's the role of the Vilna Gaon, who was quite young at the time. He was in his 20s, possibly, depending on what year it actually happened. And there's the story that the role that the Vilna Gaon plays in trying to rescue him and giving him encouragement. In fact, the Ger Tzedek Avram and Avram supposedly said that he's broken. He left everything behind. We go to the Potocki estate in Landshut, right behind the old shul, before we go to the kever of Naftali of Rupshitz, who's buried in Landshut. So there's the Potocki estate, which is this massive, beautiful, incredibly large estate. Of course, today in Back Lawrence or Tom's River, you have big estates too. But for that time, this was considered a massive estate and a huge palace. And and this is what he gave up. He gave up everything. He was the heir to this, and he gave it all up to become a Jew. And he thought he would establish a family, get married, have children, start a new life, and here he's being killed. So he expressed his disappointment that he has no past and he has no future. He lost everything on both sides. He's being cut off on both sides. And the Vilna Gaon encouraged him, and he said to him, he says that it says in the pasuk, Anihu Rishain va'anihu Achrain umi baladai ein Elokim. I am the first, I am the last, and there's no one else but me. So says God. So the Vilna Gaon says to him, Anihu Rishain lemisha ein le'av, va'anihu Achrain lemisha ein le'ben, umi baladai ein Elokim. I am the first to those who don't have a father or a parent. Anihu Achrain, I am the last for those who don't have children. Umi baladai ein Elokim. You don't need anything else. You have God with you. You're completely one with the one above. With God, there's no, you're worried that you don't have a past or a future. You're one with me, which is very inspirational. We also go on our trips to Vilna. We go to the main town square of Vilna where the public execution took place. What's also interesting about Shavuos and Jewish history, in modern Jewish history, is how Shavuos traditionally is a celebration of the receiving of the Torah, but that is only from the time of where it's cited in Chazal, in the Gemara, in Shas. In the Torah itself, it's discussed primarily as an agricultural holiday, celebration of the harvest, Bikurim, bringing Bikurim, the wheat harvest comes from the Eimer, which was the barley harvest, or the wheat harvest. And then that's how it's discussed in the Megillas Rus, which we read on Shavuos as well. And so how does it evolve from an agricultural holiday to a celebration of the Torah? And there's a simple historical reason for that, because during the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the main event is the bringing the korban of the Shtei Alechem. The main event is the bringing Bikurim to the Beis HaMikdash. All of that is agriculture, and all of that is service in the Beis HaMikdash. Of course, when there's no Beis HaMikdash, there's no karbanes, there's no Jews, pretty much, very few Jews living in the land of Israel, and they're not engaged in agriculture anymore, and there is none of all that, so then we revert to the celebration of the Torah, which took place on that day, and that becomes the emphasis. So that's obvious. I think I believe it's well known as well. But what it's interesting to me is that the secular kibbutzim, in the early days of the kibbutz movement, during the third Aliyah, attempt to bring it back as a secular holiday celebrating the harvest. They attempt to bring back the old holiday in this very secular fashion. Fascinating story. There are videos of it on YouTube. There's articles about it. It's a really interesting story. In the kibbutzim of Emek Israel, later spreads to urban places in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and the Karen Kayemet LeYisrael. They put themselves instead of the Beis HaMikdash, bringing the Bikurim. There's these Tekes Hava'at Bikurim, which existed in Israel from the 1920s, which was still Palestine, till the 1960s, and then it kind of petered out. I just recently saw a video of Menachem Musishkin, who's the head of the KKL, the Karen Kayemet Israel, presiding over one of these ceremonies in Tel Aviv, and there's thousands of children all dressed up, and they bring these baskets of produce from the harvest, and it's bringing bikurim from there. And they even had a ceremonial kohen, also a secular kohen, a Jewish, one of the modern Hebrew writers. He was an elderly man at the time, Alexander Ziskin Rabinovich, Azar, and he was at this impressive ceremony in Tel Aviv in the 1930s, and they make this as a new type of holiday, bringing back the old Bikurim in a secular fashion, as an attempt to secularize the holiday, and also as a saying that it's not a celebration of the Torah. It's going back to the biblical celebration, which is agricultural, and therefore to give it that flavor as well. So that's an interesting tidbit too. So this was some musings in Jewish history and Shavuos. And I will hopefully get back to regular episodes regularly and consistently for a full, exciting summer of Jewish history soundbites right after Shavuos. Have a wonderful Yontif. This is Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.